located in 1780 and 1785 specifically in the United States. Of course, in 1776, the British coat of arms was hanging up there, the symbol of King George III's royal authority here. So those 8 men pried the British coat of arms off the wall. For a few hours, they dragged them through the streets of Philadelphia so all the citizens could get a very good chance to properly use them, and then they set them on fire. Well, they did all this to make a simple point. King George III and his government no longer held any more power or authority here. Certainly desecrating and burning the British coat of arms, that was an act of treason. It was minor compared to all the acts of treason that occurred in the room behind you. So if you turn around and go across the hall and look at the assembly room, that's where the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution were both signed.
I got it.
Assembly room where Pennsylvania legislature met. They moved upstairs to make way for Congress. Congress began meeting here in May of 1775. It was not until July of 1776 when the men in this room could actually bring themselves to admit that they had exhausted every other option. Independence from Great Britain was the only option they had left. We've been at war with Great Britain for over 8 years before Congress finally declared independence. And we actually celebrate the long day. Congress declared independence in this room on the 2nd of July, 1776, when they voted to adopt a resolution proposed by Richard Henry of Virginia. His resolution stated that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. 2 days later, on the 4th of July, Congress voted to adopt the amended text of the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. The last thing that in this room we're all worried about is which day America should be celebrated. As far as most of these members are concerned, there's little to celebrate. In declaring independence, they are now formally going to war with the strongest power in Europe. Great Britain had the largest navy in the world, more than 534 ships. The United States had 8. Great Britain had the second largest army in Europe, but it was the best trained and it had all the best equipment. The United States had a bunch of militiamen and minutemen who had very little training and cheap equipment. No man in this room could have known France was going to be our ally. The French government didn't make that decision for only a year and a half. It very quickly occurred to the members of Congress that achieving independence was going to be much more difficult than simply declaring it. Certainly when Congress declared independence here, they had no idea how independence was going to be achieved. Certainly they figured that out when Congress met here throughout most of the Revolutionary War. 11 years after independence was declared here, the Constitutional Convention came to Philadelphia. They started meeting here in May of 1787, swore themselves to secrecy, and got down to work. They quickly realized they had to create the one thing that truly terrified them, a strong, powerful central government. They didn't have a choice. They had to create a government that wouldn't have the power to tax, a government that would be able to maintain order at home, a government that would be respected abroad. And they figured the only way of protecting them safely would be to divide the government into 3 separate branches, the system of checks and balances. You know, the one thing that the Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court have always said is for certain is the other two are watching. And if one of those 3 branches does something that they're not supposed to do, if they are not doing something that they are supposed to do, the other 2 branches are going to take action to force that 3rd branch into compliance. That's an amazing idea in the 18th century. So is the idea that one man can be the head of state, the head of government, and the head of the military. What most European governments divide up between 3 different people, we put all under the president. And one of the questions that had to be answered here was, how could you grant one man all that power? The allowed him to use it successfully but still limit his power. They came up with a lot of different ideas. One of the most radical to make it into the Constitution is the idea that although the president is the head of state, he is forced to justify himself to his people at least every 4 years. Every 4 years, he is required to stand for election. Throughout most of the world in the 18th century, to get a new head of state, he went through bloodlines or bloodline. The old head of state died. The closest living relative then inherited that position. Didn't matter if they were confident or incompetent. Didn't even really matter if they were sane or insane. They're the next one in line, unless you're willing to exercise the other option. The people or the government still the head of state and with someone else or something else in their place. So another important question here was, well, would this do American Civil War? Could you expect the president, when he's not been reelected, to hand all that power over to his successor, just walk away at a time? Quite a few of the men who wrote the Constitution in this room, they were shocked by their own work when they saw it finished up. Quite a few of these men hesitated. Can you blame them? Nothing like this had ever succeeded before. Out of the 55 men who wrote the United States Constitution, 39 of them presided. Everybody was just at the table with us, with George Washington presiding over the ceremony in that very chair. The 39 men who signed the Constitution did not go walking out through those doors saying, I can't wait to get home to explain to everybody what I've just done to them. Most of those 39 men walked out through those doors trying to figure out how they never got themselves into such a mess, and politically, how could they possibly survive it. And, you know, there's a lot of good examples of that. The simplest is one sentence in the Constitution that makes a very simple statement. Congress may not abolish the slave trade until 1808. How would you like to be a delegate in the South? Go home and explain why you've just signed a document that says in 20 years, Congress can pass legislation that will cut off your labor supply. It's not going to be any easier if you're from New England either, because, of course, how do all the enslaved people get to North America? Ships. Who owns all the ships in 18th century America? Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island. You're going to have to go home and explain to them, well, you just signed a document that basically said, well, in 20 years, Congress can pass legislation. It's really going to cost you a lot of money. There were already groups trying to stop slavery in the Middle Atlantic states, especially right here in Philadelphia. But the Quakers already starting to embrace the abolitionist cause. Of course, you'd have to explain to them why you just signed a document that basically said nothing can be done about slavery for the next 20 years. And that's only the beginnings of the problems. After all, that's one sentence out of a 5-page document. What each of these 39 men had to do was go home and explain that there certainly was a lot of difference of opinion from New Hampshire all the way down to Georgia. A lot of compromises had to be made in order to create a document that's going to be accepted by 13 very different states. They did the best job they could, and this was it. And of course, one option was, well, the states could all refuse to ratify this new Constitution, which would have meant continuing to slide toward chaos under the Articles of Confederation. Or they could ratify this new Constitution despite these laws and see how it works. And by September of 1788, 11 states had ratified, 2 more than they had needed, so they could go ahead and start holding elections. Of course, George Washington was elected our first president, and on April the 30th, 1789, on the balcony of Federal Hall at Wall Street in New York City, George Washington is sworn in under the same Constitution that our government basically functions under today. So, does anybody have any questions about anything before you go? Anything I said, anything you've seen? Yeah.
Are there any original citizens here?
Well, that chair that Washington sat in is presided at the Constitutional Convention. Again, over the courtroom, the Pennsylvania coat of arms. The inkstand up there is actually a replica. The original is now in this airtight bulletproof case over in the West Wing. Which our tour started in the East Wing. The West Wing has a collection of documents in it. You just walk into it, and one of my colleagues will talk to you. So you can see the inkstand that was used to sign the foundation documents. Of course, they're all the National Archives in Washington, D.C. But we have the first printed copies of the document. You can see the Declaration of Independence, which is known as the Dunlop Broadside. It was printed by John Dunlop, who was the official printer for Congress. That particular copy of the Declaration of Independence was handed down through the family of John Nixon and donated to the park. John Nixon was Philadelphia County Sheriff. He was also a colonel in the Pennsylvania militia, and he's the one who read the Declaration of Independence out back through our 8th of July. So we think that's actually the copy that we read from. We have a printed copy of the the Constitution, printed by Claypool, and that was actually George Washington's personal copy of the Constitution. There's also a working copy of the Articles of Confederation. It's printed, but it has notes written all over it. They were written by Elbridge Gerry, who was a member of Congress. He's one of the men who refused to sign the Constitution. And he's actually one that gives a specific reason, because the Constitution lacks the Bill of Rights. After the Bill of Rights is added, he completely backs the government back. He ends up serving in the House of Representatives. He ends up being Vice President of the United States. Anyone else? Okay, then at this point, you're just going to go out the main corridor, step to your left, you're going to exit out through the tower doors. Again, you can go see those